Congratulations, you've just found the number one over 50 health and wellness podcast on the planet. Hello and welcome to the Over 50 Health and Wellness Show. I'm your host, Kevin English. I'm a healthy aging expert and the founder of The Silver Edge, and I am on a mission to help men and women just like you build lean, strong, healthy, capable bodies they love for the rest of their lives. All right, folks, get ready. Today we are diving into a topic that doesn't get nearly enough airtime, but absolutely deserves it, and that is the area of sexual wellness and desire. Because let's be honest, if you've ever thought your low libido was just a part of getting older, you need to think again. My guest today is Dr. Diane Mueller. Diane is a naturopathic doctor, she's an acupuncturist, and she's the founder of My Libido Doc. She is an expert in helping men and women uncover the real root causes of low desire. And these are things like hormone imbalances, nutrient deficiencies, gut issues, thyroid problems, and even stress, and then fixing them naturally. So in this conversation, we dig into the science of passion. We're going to talk about why libido loss is not inevitable, how your health habits and hormones influence your desire, the surprising connection between stress, sleep, and your sex drive, and how couples in long-term relationships can rekindle intimacy and connection at any age. So, if you are ready to reclaim your vitality, confidence, and yes, your spark, then settle in. This episode is going to open your eyes to what's possible when you treat libido not as a lost cause, but as a vital sign of your overall health and happiness. All right, folks, so whip up your protein smoothies and let's meet Dr. Diane Mueller.
I can honestly tell you so many different stories here, but the intro one was actually in my early 20s. And this was at a point where I had very little knowledge on the topic at all. And I started developing this vulvar pain, and it was keeping me up at night. Doctor said I was normal, went, for tons of tests, everything looks good, but like this pain just kept going and going and going. So one day, my roommate, at the time, a lovely friend of mine back then, hands me a book that shocked me because I was very out of touch, anything sexual, anything intimate. And the book she handed me was Sex for One by Betty Dodson. Self-pleasure was a totally foreign concept to me. And not only was it foreign, due to how I was raised and the value system that I was raised, it was bad to even do. So this was a major thing to see. But lying awake one night, in pain again, it's all right, I'm going to read this book. And lo and behold, what Betty talks about in this book, she talks about a lot of things, but one of the things she talks about is that people, she was finding that as she was teaching them the art of self-pleasure, she was finding that people were having pain go away. And I was like, okay, well, that's really interesting. I'm in pain. Nobody can, fix this. So one, very brave night, I went for it. And sure enough, the pain went away. And next night, pain's back, try it again, pain's gone. So this goes on for a few days, and then all of a sudden the pain's just gone, and 25 years later, never has come back. So that's what is so wild, and it was completely awe-striking to me. And it's one of those moments in my early life that we, I think, have as humans, those kind of moments where it's okay, this makes me question some of my core beliefs. So I started asking different questions. And since I had a religious upbringing, I was asking myself questions okay, well, if God made me, in his image, how could I have this part of me that's bad? Right? If I'm if this part of me is bad, how can it be there to cure me naturally when nothing else could? So I started asking myself different questions, and it really opened up this it was like a Pandora's gate, kind of moment that just started me down into reading and studying and I've been reading and studying for many years. I've only been really doing this work now and decided, hey, let me do this professionally for about the past 3 years. But that was a Pandora's gate that said that I wanted to study sex, and I've been studying sex ever since.
That's really interesting. I think the way you describe your upbringing, I think certainly with my audience in particular here, those of us in our 50s and 60s, I think we can all relate. A lot of us grew up, if we grew up in a quote unquote religious household, sex was very taboo. Certainly, I think that most of us didn't have that sort of open dialogue with we learned about sex from friends or from, of course, there was no internet. And so your information was pretty spotty. It was not necessarily reliable. And you had mentioned, hey, not only was I uncomfortable talking about sex or certainly the journey that you were on, but I felt that maybe it was bad or it was wrong. And so kind of overcoming some of that. And I will just go ahead and throw in here, I have another podcast. It's called the Alpha Edge Podcast. It's a men's podcast. And we literally just released a episode on what the Bible has to say about sex. And anybody's interested in that, hit me up and we can talk about that. But good news is it says positive, affirming things like you should have it and have lots of it. So there is that, but I don't think that was communicated to a lot of us in our younger age. So that's really interesting. You're starting on this road now. So you've got this new book, Want to Want It, Reigniting Desire in Long-Term Relationships. Do you want to talk a little bit about what people can expect at that?
Yeah.
Why'd you write that and who's it for?
Yeah, it is for people that are in long-term monogamous relationships that are trying to find their way back to that passion and their desire for each other again. It's inspired in part by the 2023 Harvard study that came out and said, okay, of all the things we're looking at around how to live longer and happier, and in this world where there's biohacking and all these things, and we're looking oftentimes around how can we put on muscle, how can we lose weight, how can we do these things that are helpful with longevity. But the Harvard 2023 study, out of everything it looked at, what it came up with was the number one thing for better health and better happiness as we age is relationships. And that is a huge reason for doing the work I do, is really finding that so many couples have a great thing going, but they've just lost that kind of zah. They've lost that passion. They've lost that glue that is helping them have an even better relationship, right? So it's like, let's take something great and let's make it even greater. And in this book, I talk about root causes of low desire from a physical standpoint. So a lot of people are doing things like the little blue pill, using lubes and those kind of things. And great, like there's purposes for all of those things. But oftentimes when we're using those things, we're not understanding like the true root cause and the true root causes of what's going on. So I walk people in the book around, hey, here's some missing root causes. But what's I think particularly helpful about that part of the book is I say, okay, well, we know there's a thyroid root cause for low libido. It's no obvious, it's no mystery there, right? If you don't have energy, why are you going to even be, thinking about sex? The number of people that are misdiagnosed and told they're fine when they have a thyroid disorder is huge. I'd say probably 30% of people that walk into my practice and are told that their thyroid's normal. When I actually do proper full testing, we find out that it's not. So in the book, I go through, for example, what types of tests to get so you can self-advocate and say, like, actually, we didn't do a test. Like, I feel like I might have thyroid disorder. I feel like that might be affecting my health, my sex, my energy, my weight. And now I can self-advocate because now I know what tests actually are going to give me that definitive answer. So I go through that. I also go through things like conscious communication. The couples that have awesome sex and that report in surveys that saying that they have awesome sex, 92% of them talk about it. But so frequently the conversations on sex, like this is how they go. It's like one person brings something up and, maybe it's like, oh, I don't like that position or that hurt, or, maybe he went soft and you want to talk about it. And it goes horrible, right? The conversation goes horrible and she's offended and he's offended and, or they're hurt or they feel guilty and now they hurt the other person and they hurt themselves and they shove it under the rug and just be like, well, we don't really do that anymore, right? And so there's a formula and there's a strategy of how we can actually have these kind of conversations effectively. So we talk about that. I talk about how to bring novelty in, ways to spice it up. And I talk about like the science of desire. So really like what is happening in that new relationship energy that everybody, if you go back to however long ago that was for you and put yourself back there, you probably can at least remember like, oh yeah, that passion that for most of us had at that point. Well, that's scientifically, there's chemicals in the brain that are creating that passion. So when we understand the chemistry of the brain, we can actually largely find ways of recreating that type of that brain cocktail in our long-term relationships to bring that passion back in. So we talk about the science of desire as well.
Yeah, I love that. All right, so a lot to
Yeah.
unpack here, obviously. So this sounds like it would be a book then for this audience, right? If you're talking about long-term monogamous relationships. I know myself, I'm getting ready next month. I will be celebrating my 29th anniversary. So always looking for ways to deepen my connection with my wife there. But as I was going through this book, it looks like you had these three causes for low libido. You talk about the physical body, which you kind of hit on, right? With my thyroid, my master gland's not doing what it's supposed to do. That's not good. We can talk a lot more about that here as we dive in. You talk about personal root causes and then interpersonal root causes. When we talk about low libido, because what I want to get around and dispel, hopefully, is this idea that somebody out there listening is thinking, oh, well, I have low desire, I have low libido because I'm 50, because I'm 60, or heck, because I'm 70 for that matter. Could you make a case why that's not the reason why we have low libido?
100%. In fact, even take sex out of the conversation. It is one of the things that in medicine drives me the most crazy is this whole thing around age. And, I'm 45. I'm not quite as old as I know some of your listeners are. I'm old enough to know and going through perimenopause right now and I've seen it enough in my practice to know that, yes, things change with age. I'm not here to say that, oh, everything in your 40s, 50s, 60s, beyond is supposed to act exactly like how it was when our teens and 20s. That would be ludicrous. However, the conventional medical model of just saying, hey, these things are just happening because we age is really not taking enough investigation into what else could be going on. There's commonalities when we age. Like, yeah, there's perimenopause, there's menopause, there's andropause. There are hormones that change, right? Thyroid often declines. We see that change is due to inflammation for a long time do cause circulation. So with age, we have all of these things that can impact us. So with age, what happens? It's like, well, I've been eating that inflammatory food for a while, or I've had that hidden parasite for a while, or I've had that genetic issue where I can't detox something and something's built up in my body and that's creating issues. And so with age, all of these things happen. But what's happening oftentimes is we've lived long enough that all of these common stressors that we're able to deal with throughout our life have now happened for a long enough time that we have cellular damage, that we have hormonal deficiencies, we have all these abnormalities. So it's not to say that age is not a real thing, but the difference is saying like, well, I'm just getting older versus because I've lived so long, there's been certain mechanisms in the body that have gone haywire. And if I turn them around and if I get them functioning again, I can actually start, looking, feeling, acting younger. We know this too, like some of the longevity tests that are out there that are looking at our like clock age, or actually like where our DNA is looking at, right? So we have like our number age, and then we can have like the age in our body of what if we actually use these tests and we're looking like the damage of our DNA and these sorts of things. They don't always correlate. There's people that can be 60, but they can actually have a cellular age of 35. So what's the difference is they're actually usually what's happening to those people that are 60 and they have that cellular age at 35, they're able to say like, well, this is how I eat. This is how I choose things in my life. Maybe I'm fasting. Maybe I'm, probably eating organic food. I'm getting enough sleep. I'm moving my body in these ways. And so the point is there's a difference between our clock age and our actual age, right? And we know that now in science. And so the same thing can be said with libido. Like if we're just saying like, okay, age, like, yes, I'm not going to deny that is left to our own devices. Our libido is probably for most people going to decline. But how do you want to age? How do you want your relationship to look in your 50s, 60s, 70s? If you can do something about it to make it so that all of a sudden you have the vitality of somebody younger, which we know we can do in science and research, there's plenty of data to show that now. Like, do you want to? And for some people, you might wind up deciding like, Okay, well, I don't care enough to do anything. And that's a decision, but to just say that, oh, just because we age, we are victims to all of these things happening. We're way more powerful than that as human beings. And we know there's so many different ways we can manipulate our genetics. There's so many ways we can heal our cells. And there's so many ways we can continue to heal our libido. We just have to know how.
Yeah, amen to all that. I absolutely love that. So I'll tell you a personal story. I've shared this with this audience many, many times, but in my mid to late 40s, somewhere, I just health-wise completely crashed and burned. And I'll tell you very vulnerably, that was the low point in my life for my libido. I didn't have a libido there for a while. I just lost it. And when looking back, it wasn't because I was in my upper 40s. It was because I was doing everything lifestyle wrong. I was drinking daily. I was stressed out of my mind. I was basically an insomniac. I was sedentary. I was eating the standard American diet, which is a whole lot of fast food and crap. And I just was doing all of these lifestyle things wrong. And lo and behold, it had that effect on my libido. Here I am at 61, and I can honestly say, I mean, I can't remember when I was 20, but I'm sure I had a raging libido then. But I feel like I'm probably close to that now. So I love that you say, hey, look, nobody's going to defeat aging. Aging is undefeated, right? However, how we age is largely in our hands, right? We could take responsibility for that. So I'd like to use this to jump off and talk. I want to talk about all three of these things. Physical body, which I think you and I are going to agree. I'm very passionate about that. I think I got my arms around that. My audience probably does too, but I want to hit on some of this because we don't talk about libido a whole lot. And then I want to talk about more where I could use some of your help. And I think probably the rest of our audience could. Let's spend some time talking about those personal issues and interpersonal issues, what we can do there to bolster both our desire and our libidos, right? Yeah. So when you had mentioned a bunch of this already, you had mentioned things like thyroid and taking care of, but I want to start with just some basic things. Let's start with nutrition. You meant, hey, if we're eating real foods and we're eating organic, nutritionally, what's the best thing I can do if I want to ensure this physical body is capable of a high raging libido?
Yeah, I'm going to start going through this by talking about aphrodisiac foods because that comes up a lot.
Sure. Yeah. Let's go. Let's do a fun one first. Yeah.
And then I'll get into some more of the details there. But the aphrodisiac foods, I just don't agree with the concept of aphrodisiac foods. And the reason why is like, oh, oysters are said to be an aphrodisiac, right? I think they're said to be an aphrodisiac because they have a lot of zinc in them, and we need zinc for our testosterone production, as well as the ability of our cells to actually take that testosterone and have it as that free form, which is available to our cells for use. So zinc's super important for libido. Oysters have a lot of zinc. But as I talk about in my book, a lot of people, like when I eat oysters, I'm like very neutral about oysters. It's like, all right, I'll eat an oyster here and there, but like I kind of have to get myself over it and like put a lot of horseradish and a lot of things on it and slice out my mouth, and I'm just doing it because I'm like, well, zinc's good for me. It's not exactly like seductive or sexual. I'm not sitting there in the pleasure and being like, oh my God, this is amazing. I'm kind of thinking around like, how can I get this thing down my throat the fast as I can and move on with my life, right?
Yeah.
So I find more from a standpoint of aphrodisiacs, it's more about the pleasure of the moment. And if you are having an amazing meal purely just from an aphrodisiac standpoint, if you are sinking into the pleasure and you're there with you in the moment, being present, chewing your food, putting your fork down, laughing, right? That's the aphrodisiac I find is like, that's how we turn food into an aphrodisiac, is the presence of the moment. Okay. So now probably where you're really going with your question is, what do we eat? So the biggest thing, I have never in my medical practice ever subscribed with whatever disease I treat into one particular diet. So what I find is people need to be on a diet that is not inflaming them. Now, what is that going to be from one person to another? I do find that most people do great being off of gluten. Do I find that everybody like has a substantial difference when they're off of gluten? No. But I do find that getting pesticides out of your diet, eating organic as much as possible, eating free range, making sure you're getting a good balance of enough protein, especially women. Women tend to undereat protein a lot. Yep. Some of these things we see out there, like keto diet, for example, I find a lot of men do really, really well on keto diet. I find a lot of women, it destroys them and their hormones. Find a lot of men do really well on not eating as much carbs. I find a lot of women destroys them and their hormones. That being said, it's also, I find, extremely individualized. So the biggest thing I think is like, doing either a elimination diet where you're taking, and a lot of people do elimination diets wrong, where they're like, okay, I'm going to take out one food at a time. Now you need to take out all the potential offending foods, everything that is pro-inflammatory, and add them back in one at a time after being off of them for at least 3 weeks is my recommendation. Or get tested for food allergies and food sensitivities. And I find more of it is like making sure you're eating as many different colors of food so you get your nutrients, balancing your good quality proteins, eating high quality food, but just getting out the things that are inflammatory. And I can't make I don't like these things where it's like, oh, everybody needs to be off of this. We're all so different. So every person needs to be off of the things that are inflaming them. And we need to do that from a standpoint of our individual investigation.
Yeah, 100%. I'm with you there. We're all bio individuals, and there are some certain rules that are universally true, like we should eat real food, not
Yes.
highly ultra processed Franken food. Probably want to cut out the sugars and the highly refined grains, all that
Yes.
stuff. Absolutely love it. Which begs the question, in this day and age, is that enough? In other words, what's the role of supplementation? Not so much for general health. Well, I suppose libido is so intricately linked with general health that, yeah, general health. But what is the role of supplementation for somebody who's just now exploring, like they're on this healthy journey, and in their mind, it's like, I got to lose these 20 pounds, right?
Yeah.
And now here they're on this podcast and we're talking about arousal. We're talking about desire and monogamy and libido. And they're like, okay, well, yeah, I want some of that. What's the role of supplementation in that part of the path?
I mean, it's important, right? We know that zinc is needed for hormones. We know that copper is needed for hormones. We know that B vitamins are needed. We can get into the component around like, okay, thyroid. We know we need selenium for the thyroid. We know we need iron for the thyroid. We know we need tyrosine for the thyroid. So we could go in any of these hormonal pathways and and talk about these micronutrients which are needed. I think the biggest thing that I've seen in lab testing, because I lab test a lot for micronutrients, and it's very common that people are deficient in just one or two. And people that are eating, like most people that by the time they make it to me, they are extremely well educated on diet. I'm not, having these basic conversations on, what is a pro-inflammatory or anti-inflammatory food. So people come with usually like a fairly proficient nutrition knowledge, and still wind up in eating like a lot of foods deficient in one or two things. And we could look at that as like they might even be eating enough of the food with those nutrients, but when we go through long periods of stress, for example, we burn through a lot of B vitamins, we burn through a lot of vitamin C, we burn through a lot of magnesium. So our needs for those types of nutrients can go up acutely in various situations. So that could be some of it of why we can eat a balanced diet and all of a sudden we find ourselves deficient in things. The important thing to hear is a lot of people are just like, well, I'm just going to take a multivitamin. And just so everybody knows, a multivitamin does not have multi-minerals. Your mineral complex is going to be different than your vitamin complex. There's a lot of misunderstanding on that. But a lot of people will just say, I'm going to take a multi and then I'll just have my bases covered. And I do think there's places for multis. I don't think they're bad. I think especially when, people have severe things, cancer, of course, when people are pregnant, like I think there's great utility for those. But what I've seen is when people tend to be deficient in things, taking just like a multi doesn't seem to correct the deficiency because we have a pill space issue. So if like a multi has 20 different nutrients in it, it can only have like micro amounts of every nutrient in order to get all the things in the pill. Otherwise, you're going to take a pill so big you can't swallow it. So it's a real problem that supplement companies have to solve, is how they want to formulate these to get all these things and like whatever amounts they have and fit it into a tiny little pill. So because of that pill space issue, it's a very difficult time typically when people are truly deficient in a couple things to get enough from just a multi to make up for that. So that's another advantage of testing is like I said, even if people are eating really well, I do tend to find a couple of those. And I do find that in order to test to turn normal after finding that, I haven't seen that work very well with multis. I've seen it work a lot better when we can target and say, okay, we're going to focus on these one or two nutrients and give a pill with an appropriate dosing amount to actually resupplement the cells.
Yeah, and you do a great job in the book of talking about testing, and I'm a big fan of test for your deficiencies, both your mineral and your phytonutrients. You want to know where you're low. The most common are going to be like magnesium and D, and maybe some of the B complex. So I think probably some omega-3 fatty acid supplementation, things like that. But yes, testing and then supplementing, because I think that a lot of what's happening here when it comes to libido, I think, is that a lot of the precursors for hormonal health are going to be in these nutrients, right? If they are out of whack, out of balance, it's going to be really hard for them to physiologically do all the good things that they're supposed to do in order to give us a nice, healthy libido. Is that fair?
Oh, it's very fair. If we're inflamed, if we're deficient in nutrients, like we're not going to be making our hormones, our brain's not going to be working correctly. We might be too stressed, our muscles might be tense. We're not going to be making our thyroid. We're not going to be circulating I mean, we can go on and on and on. Like nutrients run really every process in the body. So we need our nutrients, our micronutrients to do these sorts of things that we have around the body. And if we're deficient, the widespread impacts are going to be pretty significant.
Yeah, 100%. Okay. So let's move on from nutrition. I want to talk about exercise, another area I'm very passionate about. I suppose that being sedentary versus being fit, there's going to be a big difference there for libido. Is that fair?
Oh, yeah. I think that's a pretty obvious thing people can wrap their brain around. And
Yep.
some of it is like, okay, well, exercise gives us energy, but also, under like the personal pillar, one of the things I talk about is the research on body image. And
Mm.
there is very, very clear research around like if people don't feel good in their bodies, if they're looking at self in the mirror and they're saying, well, I don't like that. Well, who's going to want to get naked when you're saying that about yourself? So anything that we can do to help us feel sexier, healthier, more happy in our body. We also have to remember that as we age, we're not going to chase perfection, right? There is something that I do think has to happen with age around accepting some of the changes, like skin changes, and like there's just body changes. We all know that. But that being said, we do have, again, the power, and making sure we're staying physically fit, not only is helping us have the stamina and the energy for the bedroom, but it also is helping us make us feel better in our body. And usually people that feel better in their body have a lot more interest in being naked.
Yeah, that's a good point. I hadn't put that together yet. The confidence and that bleeding over into libido, that clearly I can make that connection. But I think also there are some hormonal benefits to things like strength training and having good cardiovascular health. We're going to talk about blood flow here in a minute, but I definitely want a healthy circulatory system. If I have more muscle, that's going to increase things like growth hormone and testosterone, important for both men and women, of course. So yeah, I'm with you there 100%. So before we leave the physical body, I want to talk about, and this is going to bleed into, I'm sure, the personal side as well. I want to talk about sleep and stress.
Mm-hmm.
So I believe both of those, if not managed correctly, are going to be just libido wrecking balls. Is that fair? Let's start with sleep. What happens if I'm not a healthy sleeper? How is that going to affect my libido?
I mean, a lot of different ways. I mean, one thing we always have to remember is like the long-term impacts of things, right? So there's the obvious thing, right? The obvious thing is like, well, I'm tired, I'm exhausted, I'm trying to survive my day. I just want to go back to bed. How am I going to, after like all of that, how do I have energy to put into making love to my partner? So that's the obvious. Right. But then we have to think about other things that are happening during sleep. So we release growth hormone when we sleep. You mentioned growth hormone. Another huge thing that we do with sleep is that we have our lymphatic system of our brain, which is like the detox portion of our brain, really becomes active in our sleep. So if we have any toxic stress, any inflammation that's kind of built up during the day, when the lymphatic system gets activated, it's kind of clearing that trash out. So if we don't sleep well, that's not activated, we can wake up also then dealing with brain fog, with like depression, with things because our brain's a little toxic. So that's another mechanism with sleep. And another big one that this was so exciting to me when I first discovered this study, which was when we sleep for less than 6 hours a night, then we wake up and for the next 24 hours, we are insulin resistant. And I was so excited to learn this because I've noticed for myself that any time that I have a poor night of sleep, and luckily I'm a pretty good sleeper, but if I have a poor night of sleep, I have these like crazy carb
Yeah.
cravings, right?
Yeah.
And so I've had to like
Yep.
watch that the next day around like, okay, I don't know what this is, but just like watch what you're doing. Well, that's like so seeing that study, I was like, oh, I'm insulin resistant. This is why I'm craving this. My cells are not getting the sugar they need, so I'm craving it more. And so of course that leads to this, this stress on the body that leads to oftentimes making not as great food choices. So, yes, there's that obvious thing with sleep of like, well, I'm tired. How do I feel like making love when I'm tired? But then there's these other downstream mechanism things that are, wind up happening when we're not sleeping well that also have an impact.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of sleep. I've said on the show many, many times, I think that healthy sleep is the foundation of over 50 health. So
Yeah.
we don't have to beat that to death. I think most people can see that. Now, I think that every person listening to this is going to resonate with this. Stress is not only a buzzkill, it's a libido killer. I think maybe, and this is just my own personal slant here, maybe more so for women than men, perhaps. But you want to talk a little bit about stress and what's happening there? What's going on besides the obvious? So of course I'm stressed, I'm not in the mood, but it's a little deeper than that, isn't it? When we look at that relationship between stress and libido.
Well, it is. And I want to bring up the work of Dr. Emily Nagoski, she's done a lot of work on this topic and talks about this thing, stress and sex in relationship. The way she calls it is like brakes and accelerators. And she's like, oh, some things are brakes for some people as far as their libido, and other things are not. So there might be people listening that are like, well, gosh, when I get stressed out, like I get revved up. And I've met people throughout my life that are just like, they almost use it as a stress relief. And like, all of a sudden, if they're stressed, or like that's actually when their libido is the strongest. That can happen. So it can be an accelerator. Now, I do find that for the majority of humans, and in my experience in talking to people, especially for women, but I do think it can go both ways. But like women I've talked to experiences at a higher amount than men I've surveyed, is that it actually winds up being that break. Right. And we can look at this in like a few different ways. I mean, the most obvious one is cortisol impacts testosterone. So when cortisol goes up, our testosterone goes down. And especially when we're looking at menopause, andropause, where these levels are oftentimes already low, and really in our society, even before menopause and andropause, they're often way too low. So then we take too much cortisol, which, by the way, just to kind of tie this all together, if we're doing long-term suspended cardio, like our long-distance running, our long-distance biking,
Right.
that's going to raise cortisol, which can turn down testosterone. So we want to kind of throw that in as like certain types of exercise tend to be more libido promoting than others. But that's one of the mechanisms. It's like as, cortisol goes up beyond the obvious around like I'm just tired, worn out, and overwhelmed, we see it can negatively impact testosterone. We also see that cortisol can create, when we have like our normal thyroid hormone, there's another form of thyroid hormone called reverse T3, reverse thyroid hormone. And reverse thyroid hormone, reverse T3, will block regular thyroid hormone from working. So we can have all of this great thyroid hormone, but if we have too much of this reverse T3, the cells are not going to be able to use it. It'll block the utility of it. So our body at a cellular level is going to act like we're tired, act like we have thyroid hormone problems just because too much of this reverse T3. Well, high cortisol levels will help us create more of that reverse T3. So there is that element too. So it's like, okay, we have that obvious stressor, but just kind of like sleep. It's like that obvious thing. And then because we're a connected body through our hormones, through our circulatory system, through our nervous system, through our fascia, on and on and on, one little thing, of course, is going to have a chain of reactions. And all of those reactions, like in these examples, can impact as well.
Yeah, 100%. I'm with you there. I think most of us can just relate anecdotally to stress, how that impacts us. But there's all these physiological effects. And like you said, cortisol is not bad. It's not good, but we want cortisol in its appropriate dose in our body, right? We want it to be high in the morning and low at night and have this natural circadian rhythm the way it's supposed to. So, but we don't want is that chronic stress, chronically elevated cortisol producing all the time sort of thing. That's not going to help our libido at all. All right. So just a couple other things here on the body. Let's talk about, we briefly talked about this, but what about circulation? I have talked to sexual health expert who says, hey, look, sexual health is whole body health. And in fact, sexual health can be, and this is a male doctor talking about men having erectile dysfunction problems, that could be the canary in the coal mine. That could be a psychological issue, but it could be a much more serious indicator of something going on. Do you want to talk a little bit about circulation for men and women and how that ties into libido?
Yeah. I mean, in cardiologists I've talked to, cardiologists will tell me that ED is one of the first signs that men make their way into their office, usually through primary care first. But it's like usually the first thing that is saying, hey, here's the impetus that something's wrong. And like you said, it is a systemic problem. So if there's something going on in the penile tissue of saying lack of circulation, lack of microcirculation, the way the body works, it's not only happening in the penis, it's happening in the whole body, right? So that's a super important thing to understand. And I always I wish we would get the word dysfunction out of it. I think we should talk about this as imbalance. I hate the word dysfunction. It makes it seem like, it just makes it, there's just so much taboo around it. And really all we're saying is like, oh, your body, your heart, your blood vessels, something's not working right. Like we got to figure that out. It's just an imbalance, right? I think another point to bring up here is it does, like you said, it gets talked a lot about for men, but we can have the same issue for women. Women need circulation for their erectile tissue to get engorged. And if they're having sex and it hurts, if there's any pain, if it's just not feeling as enjoyable, lube is an important thing, right? We got to be lubricated, but it's not just about the lube. The lube is about the viscosity. That's one piece of it feeling good. The second piece about it feeling good is that tissue being engorged and softened. And that is our circulatory system. So for women that are experiencing pain with sex or pelvic pain, or if they've like lost sensation, some of that is also could be a circulatory issue. Many times it's many things in all of these cases. And you're not getting that blood flow to that tissue to properly engorge it so it feels good.
So obviously critical that we have that circulatory health there. What about, we can't get away with talking about the physical body and libido without talking a bit more about hormones. So can you talk about, as I was reading through your book, it's kind of interesting. I know that I have testosterone and estrogen, and both are important, and same with ladies, right? But talk a little bit about the importance of hormones and hormone balance, hormone optimization, and when, let's kind of finish up or talk about hormones. When is it time to start considering things like TRT or HRT, hormone replacement therapy?
You know, as soon as they start going down, first of all. But we also, and I want to say that cautiously because we always want to know the reason why. So I do feel like we want to be checking, in on our hormones really throughout our lives, our 20s, our 30s, our 40s and beyond. We want to be knowing where we're at. Now, what we see from a standpoint of like health, both from a standpoint of sexual health, as well as cognition, bone health, heart health, all these things, is that the earlier we start these hormones, when they start going down, the better results we have with longevity. Now, that being said, sometimes these imbalances are from other things we're talking about, right? Sometimes testosterone's low because there's a cortisol issue. Sometimes if our cholesterol goes too low from overeating industrial seed oils, which can raise cholesterol, but in many cases can actually make people's cholesterol go really low. And cholesterol is the building block for things like testosterone, like estrogen. We make these hormones out of it. So, we can be in a situation through our diet where, our hormone levels being low, we don't need HRT, we need these things. So there's not a perfect age truly that I have found. Now, when we are saying, okay, now we are at an age where it makes sense, menopause time, perimenopause time, andropause time, oftentimes around the age of 40, right? That's when we want to say, we want to keep close eye on these, and we want to start on these things typically as early as possible because that's where the benefits are. But the point being is sometimes we do want to start on these in our 20s or 30s if there's reason to, but it's kind of a combination of using HRT, but also wanting to say, what else is going on that is preventing our body from producing these things as well as it could? Obviously, age will do that, but there's a lot of other mechanisms that'll do that as well. And we want to make sure that we're not just like supplementing these things when we truly have a root cause that we could actually address.
Yeah, I love all that. And I think this is fascinating. I told you that in my 40s, I just kind of crashed and burned. And so did my testosterone. I mean, it was 270 or something at its lowest, which is a very, very low. In fact, that brings up another piece of conversation here. The quote unquote normal range, I think, for testosterone for men now is like 300 to
Yeah.
1800 or something. It just keeps sliding south, right?
Yes.
As Americans are getting sicker and sicker and sicker and weaker and weaker and weaker and having lower and lower baseline testosterone. So it may be that you go to your general doctor, you say, hey, I think my hormones are out of whack. You get a test, and let's say if I come back and my total testosterone is 301, then I'm normal. Congratulations, you're fine. When in fact, if I'm experiencing all of these symptoms, and I know it's more complicated than just one testosterone test, but still, if I'm having all these symptoms of low testosterone, I want optimal health. I want optimal hormone levels. So I think that what I tell my guys is, look, once you've done everything you possibly can lifestyle wise and you're still testing low, that's when it's time to say, okay. And by low, I don't mean 301. I mean, if you're low and having symptoms, it's time to go around your doctor if you need to, go to a functional health practitioner, go to somebody who's interested in you optimizing your health, not you being just not sick. So is it fair to say that that would be a similar prescription
Oh,
for the ladies?
100%. 100%.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly right. And like, because anytime we're doing HRT, it's always a combination with looking at labs. And we want to look at labs and make sure we're not like, astronomically high. Like, I don't want a man running around with a 2000 testosterone, for example, right? Like,
Yeah.
but we want to combine the labs with symptoms. And somebody might feel, really great at a 850 or 900 testosterone, and somebody might need theirs at 12 or 1300 to feel great. And so we want to kind of combine where those levels are at with the symptoms to know all that. But yes, we also want to make sure that we are addressing the lifestyle, and that is true for men and women. It's a really important point you brought up, the reference range, and that I just want to address the fact that that's not just for testosterone that we're talking about here today.
Good point.
It's really for estrogen, it's progesterone, it's thyroid, it's
Yeah.
cortisol, it's all of these things. It's like the number of times people walk into my office with a test and they're like, well, I've already tested for this, I don't want to test it again. Like, well, no problem, but let me look at the test. And I look at the test and it's like, okay, well, this is great. We have information, but I'm sorry you're not well. I'm sorry we know the problem, right? I'm sorry you were told that your T is fine or your E is fine or whatever. There's actually a legit problem here. So you do want to work with somebody that is actually going to say, hey, this is a problem. And like for the listeners, like the way we make these reference ranges is just ludicrous. Like what labs do
It
is we like pool all the information together and we're like, we're going to get rid of the top 2.5 and the bottom 2.5 of everybody that put these labs in. We're going to say the top 2.5 and the bottom 2.5 of the range are problematic. And everybody in the middle is normal. But if you look at thyroid, the people that are testing their thyroid are not healthy people typically. Some of them are, but there are people that have fatigue and bowel problems and hair loss and or the opposite side of things. And so they're the people with the thyroid symptoms. And now we're trying to argue that 95% of the people that have thyroid symptoms are normal. It's like when
It's crazy,
break
isn't it?
down, it's like, what
Yeah.
are we living on?
I'm with you. Yeah, reference ranges are maddening, and it is. It's across the board. If you're going to test a sick, unhealthy population and say that the mean is now our normal reference range, those of us that are interested in optimizing our health are in trouble.
Exactly.
Yeah, 100%. I'm with you there. All right. Well, I think we've got the physical side of this pretty well. I want to talk about some of the personal root causes. So, as an individual working on myself, what are some things I can do to increase my libido, my desire to become a more libidinous human?
From the personal side of things, there's a lot. And when we get into the personal side of things, I'm looking at body confidence, body image, genital image. And this happens like for women, it happens because of women thinking their inner and outer labia are supposed to look a certain way, that their hair is supposed to look a certain way. there's actually a lot of studies on this around how women feel about how they're supposed to look. And just like the body image, there's a genital image thing. Men, it could be size, it could be shape, these sorts of like similar types of things, like how we look can dramatically impact how we feel. So we want to get work on any of that. Any sort of shame. I love this episode that you said at the beginning that you did on your other podcast around the Bible and the faith. I'm a real big fan of like religion and the values. And so, to actually start looking and saying, okay, well, how do we have our beliefs and how do we incorporate these beliefs into a way into our lives where we don't have shame around this particular thing is really important. And then another big thing in our body, in the personal side of things, is how well we know our body. And for men, this is oftentimes things like how well can we control our orgasms, right? Are we able to, there's like techniques out there where men can, with the average time that a man lasts is 5 minutes as far as penetrative sex. But there's techniques out there where men can have non-ejaculatory orgasms. There's techniques out there where men can basically edge and stay at that like 7, 8, 9 range before they orgasm and climax and stay there for 20, 30 minutes longer. So we can start to learn those techniques ourselves so that we can bring them into our lovemaking skills. And then one of the important things too for women to start to understand, and here's my picture. So for anybody that's just listening to this, I encourage you to go watch this because I have a picture up. And so what I'm showing is that the clitoris, which like we think of as like this little bulb at the top, that little nub, is only one part of the clitoris. But it actually has this kind of shaft, which is above it, kind of looks like the top of a wishbone, and these 2 long legs. So the full clitoris really looks like a wishbone. And what is important about this is the clitoris has 8,000 nerve endings, and it is so much more sensitive. There's so much more here than the vagina. And when only 18 to 30% of women can actually climax with penetrative sex alone, when we leave this part of the anatomy out, we're actually leaving a woman out of a high amount of pleasure. And one big reason for women why libido can go down is that their orgasms are just not that great. Sometimes they're not having them at all. And then we go through menopause, and for many women, due to a lot of different reasons, if they were having them, all of a sudden they go down. This can be through blood flow, neurological, and more. But part of that is we got to start waking the tissue up. And when we actually start doing things to stimulate like those full legs, this allows the bulbs, which are kind of the bulbs are, if like you look at the vulva, it's really that area between the outer and inner labia is where the vestibular bulbs are. This is these engorge huge. It's kind of like in many ways like the erectile tissue of the penis. It's really gets actually quite big, this area. And so the bigger this area gets through stimulation, the more pleasure it is for a woman. And so a lot of what we're doing in the personal side of things is we're actually pleasure mapping ourselves. We're actually learning about our own body to say, oh, the right side of me versus the left side of me needs touch this way or another, and the important thing to understand is this is not a one-time thing. This changes day to day. This changes year by year. For menstruating women, it's like different throughout times of the month. For non-menstruating women, it can be very different, like pre and post menopause. But it, like I said, it can even change on a day-to-day basis. So we need to start learning kind of our tendencies. So then when we can get to pillar 3 around the interpersonal, we can start coming to our partner with like more knowledge. Like it's interesting how often we are taught in our society that our partner is supposed to just automatically know what we want and what we need, when most of the time we don't even know what we want and we need.
Yeah, that's very well put. And as you were talking about that, I was scribbling down some notes. The whole idea of pleasure mapping and this idea that we are so disconnected from these beautiful, sacred physical bodies, our physicality. Most of us are so disconnected. And I hadn't really thought about it before this conversation right now. I think of that more in just the general physicality of our bodies, but when we bring in this whole dimension of sexual physicality with all of the everything that we've got, all the history and things that we bring from childhood and adolescence and what culture thinks and whatever our background is, that makes that a wilderness, doesn't it?
Yes.
This idea of what is, how do I explore my body, understand my body, have a loving, healthy relationship with my body in that sexual arena, I think is an area certainly that's impactful to me. As you say that, I'm saying, okay, there's some work clearly I can do with myself here. Now, you had mentioned, hey, this is when we have this information, now we can go into this interpersonal dimension. And I'm going to speak for most of the guys out there. Maybe this is true for you. Maybe it isn't. I think most of us would rather wrestle a grizzly bear than have an honest, vulnerable conversation about intimacy with our wives. Even like I said, I'm coming up on 29 years here. Why is that a difficult conversation? What is blocking some of us from having these very real, meaningful relationships when it comes to what we want, what we need, how we can grow closer? And is it a fair assumption on my part that that's harder for guys than ladies, or is that just an N equals one kind of
I think it's
example?
an N equals one kind of example. And I think the reason is in many ways evolutionary. And I don't want to say that just like super cliche. I have reasons for saying that because what we see in research around common conversations between couples, like anytime there's like, oh, this is going to be a hard conversation, not talking about sex, there's always three threats to the relationship: the threat to one individual, the threat to the other, and the threat to the joint space. But what studies have shown when it comes to talking about sexual intimacy is that there's one threat that is actually legitimately more under threat than the other two. And that is the threat to thyself. And so if I bring up sex to my partner, I am going to have this deep primal drive to protect myself at all costs. That's what research shows. And so I think because of that, anytime we're under threat, what do? Our sympathetic system's upregulated. We're in fight or flight, which means I'm scanning for things that are problems. I'm looking for possible cues. I'm looking for body language. I'm looking for words. So we're showing up to these conversations oftentimes primally because of this, not with open curiosity, but from a standpoint of, am I safe? And so the way we begin to hear each other is so much like, crap, I did something wrong. I'm not providing. I'm not a good lover. I'm not like, they don't like me. Oh my God, I'm bad in bed. All of those kind of stories. The moment we hear one thing, it's like so easy for us to rush into those stories, those beliefs, those thoughts. And so we don't listen from the same point that we do when we're in that parasympathetic curiosity, right? So I think that's why I bring up primal, is because of studies like that. And so the way, book 3 is going to be all about my methodology on how to do this. So there's many steps to this, but I always like when this comes up to give people the foundational step, because it's a very easy place to start and usually can happen without ramifications, without negative ramifications. It will happen with positive ramifications. But the first step is largely only saying positive things and just starting to weave into the conversation just things that you love, and be specific about something to do with your sex, physical, intimate life. And if people aren't having sex, I always like to say, hey, you can do the same activity around the way they hug you, the way they kiss you, the way they hold your hands. This can work in a lot of different ways to kind of repair erotically communication. So essentially what you're doing is you're saying, oh, like let's say you love the way they kiss your neck, right? And so what you're going to say to your partner is like, oh, the way you kiss my neck, I don't know if I've ever told you about this, but the way you do that, it just makes my whole body soften and I get tingles and I feel good. And you want to get into that realness of what's actually happening in your body and make it alive and be very, very specific. So there's two things that are happening here. One is when we talk about the things we love, sometimes the things that we don't like as much fade away because we're focused. We tend to, when we tell our partner the things we love, we tend to get more of it, and there's only so much time. So sometimes it's like, oh, that thing you didn't like just falls away and you never even have to talk about it. People do tend to have to talk about things that are not going as well, for them later on. But the other thing we're doing is we're retraining the primal brain, that is in that safety around this. And we're retraining it like neuroplastically to say, oh, every time we talk about sex or intimacy, all I hear is, I'm so awesome at this. I'm such a great lover. Like, wow, my partner feels so appreciated by me. So we're starting to build that safety. And like the Gottmans at the Gottman Relationship Institute have done a great job in their research to really identify in relationships that for every one negative thing we have to tell our partner, we need at least five positive things to balance it, right? And with sex, I haven't done a survey like that, so I don't have a specific number I can say with sex, but I suspect if a survey were to be done, it would be more just because of that primal nature. But regardless of that, what we're doing is we're building that relationship safety, sex, communication bucket up so high so that if every once in a while we're like, hey, we need to change this thing, you're already like positioned now as this person, this man, this woman that is really doing so many things that are amazing to bring your partner so much love and so much passion and so much care and so much connection, so that if you tweak one little thing, it's not going to send the nervous system, because the nervous system's now programmed. There's this new neuronal network. So there's this one little thing that disrupts it here and there. That nervous system is so strong and that path's so strong. Now you're safe. Now the relationship's safe. Now the communication's safe. So you're not going to get bumped off that course from those other things that need to be said.
I love all of that. I love that idea of having a conversation. What did you call it? In parasympathetic curiosity. And guys, parasympathetic is the rest and digest part of the nervous system. It's that calm and tranquil piece as opposed to the sympathetic, which is basically your fight or flight. So absolutely love it. Lots of great information there. So Diane, as we're wrapping up here, we've mentioned the book, Want to Want It, Reigniting Desire in Long-Term Relationships. You had just quickly there mentioned in book 2 or book 3, I think. So this is book 1 of book 3. Those of you on YouTube, she's holding it up right there. But tell people where they can learn more about you, where they can get the book, how they can connect with you, potentially work with you. Hit us. What do you got?
Yeah, so wanttowantit.com. That's where you can find this book. That's where you'll find my other 2 books that are coming out as well on the topic. So super easy to find there. And then I definitely recommend people go to mysexdoc.com. That's where we are dumping all of our free giveaways. That's where we're dumping all of our favorite toys, tools, techniques that we have vetted for you guys as far as trying new things and bringing more novelty in your relationship. So I have, novelty checklists there. I have lube guides. It's amazing how many people, this is another physical thing we didn't get to, but it's amazing how many people are using lubes that are actually damaging the vagina microbiome. Mm-hmm. And when that happens, that can lead to a lot of pelvic pain and other problems, right? So I have my lube guide on there. That's for free. I have a free book on there called Revive Your Love Life, 5 Easy Steps to Orgasms and Romance, and a ton of other free gifts. So that's real easy way to get started. So wanttowantit.com for my book, or mysexdoc.com for a whole list of freebies, plus a whole list of vibrators, products, toys, discounts, and more.
Gotcha. And of course, we've got the book. We'll put links to all of that in the show notes. You've got a podcast. There's tons of ways to connect with you, learn more. Folks, I'll put all of that, the socials, everything into the show notes for this episode. You can find that on whatever app you're listening to that on, of course, our website as well. Diane, I want to thank you so much for coming on to the show with us, sharing all your knowledge and your wisdom around this subject. I encourage you to keep up this great work. I think this is a conversation more of us specifically in this age demographic need to be having. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for being here, and thank you everybody for listening with such open hearts.
Okay, that's our show for today, folks. If you are interested in learning how the Silver Edge Collective program can help you feel lean, strong, and confident again, you can find a link to learn more in the show notes for this episode, and you can find those on whatever app you are listening to this on, or head over to silveredgefitness.com/385. As we wrap up our time together today, you can show your support for this show in 2 important ways. The first is to tell a friend about this podcast and encourage them to give it a listen. The second is for you YouTube folks to click the like and subscribe buttons, and for you podcast folks to please give this podcast a 5-star review on whatever platform you listen to podcasts on, and be sure to subscribe and follow so you don't miss any future episodes. I really appreciate you spending your time with me today, and until next time, stay strong.